Industrial roots and strong community spirit seem to characterize Cleveland, Ohio. The last city one might expect something completely out of the ordinary to occur. It is behind these red-bricked houses that the Adams family's life sat in quiet testament to the truth that even in the most quiet communities, very dark secret can reside. By the late 1990s, the Adams family seemed the very picture of prosperity and stability. A pillar of rectitude, John Adams had worked for years to ensure that his wife Claire and son Evan, by a previous marriage, lived a life of comfort. Their house was in an upper-middle-class neighborhood and was pristine, the Adamses presenting to the world an image of order and cohesion. To all who knew her, Claire Adams was the faithful wife and stepmother. Elegant and ever busy with community work, she seemed to have everything just the way she wanted with her husband and stepson. But behind this mask of perfection lay hidden from prying eyes the feeling of loneliness and discontentment within Claire. John was gone most of the time, and she was left all alone with nothing but herself, only her thoughts for companion. A marriage that once seemed picture-perfect wore thin. At 19, Evan Adams was at a transitional phase. He was a quiet and reflective young man who had never been close to his father since his biological mother passed away. John, though trying to be a good father, had never cultivated a deep relationship with Evan, and this remoteness was increasing with Evan's age. On the other hand, Claire always tried to fill this emotional vacuum in Evan's life and acted as a surrogate mother for him. First, their relationship was normal for a stepmother and her stepson. They had common interests, would comfort each other when John was away, and enjoyed each other's company. As Claire grew lonely and Evan searched for some sense of belonging, the nature of their relationship slowly started changing. Small gestures of tenderness and long conversations about life's struggles became something more. Claire, needy for attention and affection, saw in Evan not just a young man whose path in life needed to be outlined. To her, he was a person who could fill the void in her life. Evan saw Claire in another light, as a woman who would understand him and who perhaps was also lost like him. This bond, though innocent at the beginning, turned out to be a mutual attraction pretty quickly. What had started as a means of emotional support became a relationship that was taboo and would eventually ruin everything the Adams had worked for. The secret affair of Claire and Evan now, based on desire and danger, began to see each other in secrecy and hide their feelings and actions from John. Like all dark secrets, though, how Claire and Evan conducted their affair was only going to surface, with consequences that would shake not just the Adams family but the whole Cleveland community on how the dark side of human desire and betrayal had taken its toll on them. Evan Adams was that kind of young man who had always been deep in thought, out of necessity, due to his navigation through life without his biological mother. He had grown up disassociated from his father John, who, though a good provider, couldn't connect with his son emotionally. To Evan, Claire Adams embodies a great deal of the maternal figure he so longs for. She was warm, attentive, and found in Evan that which no one else did, a vulnerable young man, but full of potential. Claire had first tried to fill this hole John left in terms of emotional absence by offering Evan the attention and affection he never got from his father. At first, their interactions were innocent and revolved around discussions about youth issues, mutual support, and encouragement. This closeness, with time, began to metamorphose into something else. Claire, neglected and lonely in her marriage, started finding in Evan a companionship that bordered on more than friendship. Evan, in turn, began to see Claire not just as a mother figure, but as a person who understood him like no one else did. What was basically a harmless relationship suddenly became so much more in its intent. They started meeting at times they knew John wouldn't be around. Touches on the hands, lengthy eye contacts, and conversations that left one with the feelings of implied emotions were starting to occur more and more often. A mere spark of curiosity and affection soon turned into flames of desire and passion. Evan, inexperienced and young, was completely twisted around Claire's fingers. He was willing to do whatever it took to keep her close to him, even turn on his own father. Claire was torn inside. She knew what she was doing was wrong, yet she just couldn't help herself from this attraction and the feeling of being wanted again. Closer the two became, the more dangerous exposure became. Still very busy, John could not help but notice changes in both behaviors. Evan, once so quiet and withdrawn, was now more confident, almost defying. Claire, on her part, became more aloof, oftentimes lost in thought, and sometimes leaving the house without any explanation at all. Yet, with the increasingly told tale on their faces, John could not envision the truth. In his mind's eye, it was impossible to imagine that his wife was having an affair with his son. Behind closed doors, however, the liaison between Claire and Evan had only just begun to edge them closer to the point of no return. John Adams, torn by suspicion, began to pay attention to details that went over his head before. Claire constantly going out without being clear. Messages from Evan which he would hurriedly cover on the entry of his father, and the way the two clearly avoided eye contact in his presence. These small but incessant signals began to break his confidence. That night, after a business meeting, John arrived home a little too early. The house was unusually quiet, and he felt no need to announce his presence. As he climbed up the stairs, he clearly heard whispers coming from Evan's room. His heart started pounding as he opened the door to see Claire and Evan sitting on the bed, indulged in some very intimate conversation, with their hands locked in each other's. The shock paralyzed John, and he could not confront them in the behavior right then. He turned his back, closed the door softly, and left the house to see if he could comprehend what he had just witnessed. For the next few days, John thought he had to turn detective. He followed Claire and Evan everywhere, rechecking all the messages and calls. Every new revelation brought a sting to his heart and fire to his blood. He then confirmed his suspicion, a message exchange clearly indicating the involvement of the two. This cut deep. John felt like the ground had vanished from under his feet. One tense night, he couldn't bear the anguish anymore. John confronted Claire and Evan. The atmosphere in the house was red hot, with a silence reaching pitch that seemed unbearable. John detonated to the effect that he knew about the affair and explanation demanded. Claire was overcome by feelings of guilt and tried making an excuse, while Evan, in a state of panic, tried to pacify. Things soon got out of hand. Anger turned to fury as John's anger and Evan's fear suddenly metamorphosed into a violent fight. In the melee, something blind seized hold of Evan. He clutched a heavy object in the room, which he used in a frantic bid to save himself and Claire by hitting John on the head. The impact was fatal. The house, which a few minutes ago was filled with shouts and accusations, was now plunged into terrifying silence. Evan sat in shock, paralyzed in front of his father's body. Claire, in shock too, struggled to make out what had occurred. She quickly realized the severity of the situation, and thus, smacked by fear, planned a way to hide the crime. In the coming few days, Claire and Evan would do everything possible to ensure that there are no traces of evidence which may lead Evan to the murder charge. They tidied up the scene, concealed John's body, and came up with a false story for his disappearance. All this pressure of cover-up would be tough to bear on both. Evan, already emotionally fragile, would start showing signs of collapse. Claire would try to keep the normalcy intact. For Claire and Evan, time was running out. Convinced they had committed the perfect crime, a police investigation began to unravel. Discrepancies in their stories, Evan's erratic behavior, everything aroused the detective's suspicions. What really started to turn the investigation around was when a neighbor came forward to describe seeing strange movement at the Adams house on the night John disappeared. This, coupled with a few messages found between Claire and Evan, can spell out an unavoidable conclusion for the police. Claire and Evan were arrested and charged with John's murder when the evidence piled up against them. It was a shocking blow to the community, and their image of this perfect Adams family was completely destroyed. The trial itself was well broadcast by the media, where they tread on every wicked detail of the case and revealed it in full view to the public. In the end, Claire was sentenced to life imprisonment, while Evan received a lesser sentence in consideration of his youth and emotional influence from Claire. For both, the life they knew was all over. Some forbidden love affair that had resulted in a murder and the downfall of an entire family. This eventually put Claire and Evan in a desperate situation after the crime. On realizing what had happened, Claire's first impulse was to protect Evan at whatever cost. But the situation hit them hard within a very short period. They knew they couldn't just bury the body of John and think that everything would go away. Hence, Claire came up with a scheme to conceal the murder, hopes that they would be able to get away. For the next several days, Claire and Evan frantically cleaned up the crime scene. Bloodstains, signs of struggle, and all those ordinary things so as to make the house look normal again. Claire fabricated a story about John's sudden disappearance using her wit. He left on a business trip unannounced. This was something that, albeit individually thought of, would not be entirely out of the ordinary for a man as preoccupied as he. As the nights and days passed, the secrecy slowly bore down on them both. Evan, young and unstable in his own psyche, had started in other ways with his outward appearance of what was happening. He felt haunted by the guilt and horror of what he had done, inasmuch as he could not sleep or focus on anything but that vivid memory of the moment when he took his father's life. Claire realizes Evan's state and struggles to stay in control of events. She too is beginning to be worn down by her share of guilt. Meanwhile, John's long absence started raising questions. Claire's friends, co-workers, and neighbors started to ask her where John was. Her account regarding the business trip took a nosedive when she couldn't specify where John had gone to or when he would be back. Detectives began to take interest and soon started a preliminary investigation that would soon be upgraded. Inconsistencies began to show up over time. The change in Evan's behavior, which turned silent and Claire suddenly becoming nervous, did not escape the clock of the investigating police. Further, they sneaked in to find out that John had not planned for any business trip. Something again that gave them a shiver down the spine. They also came across a neighbor who informed the police that on the night John disappeared, he saw Evan and Claire moving something heavy out of the house. A more serious probe ensued. The final blow came in the form of text messages exchanged between Claire and Evan. These messages were recovered to reveal the relationship and that they were up to something much more sinister. With the evidence stacking up, police confronted Claire and Evan, and both eventually cracked under pressure and confessed to the crime. The trial that followed was just as sensational, and the media subsequently turned its floodlights on the most mundane and tawdry details of this unfortunate episode in their family history. Claire was portrayed as the scheming woman who had enticed her young stepson to commit the heinous crime of murder. Evan was seen as a victim of circumstance, tool in Claire's hands, but still guilty of having carried out the heinous act. Claire was sent to prison for life without parole. Her existence, which had been enveloped in the vision of being treated with respect and holding her head high, was thereby destroyed. She became a tragic and despised figure. And so life, though the sentences were less severe because of his youth and Claire's influence upon him, was ruined for Evan. He was sentenced to a long term, though there was the possibility of parole after a few years, but the weight of what he had done would be something that he would carry forever. The Adams' downfall was now complete. What began as a forbidden love affair had ended in tragedy and destruction, not only for Claire and Evan, but for the entire community that surrounded them. Darkly reminiscent, the story became of how desire and betrayal can lead to devastating consequences, destroying lives and entire families in the process. Even after the trial, the story of Claire and Evan Adams continued to haunt Cleveland. A once quiet community was now scarred by scandal and tragedy, and the case became a dark example of the dangers of buried secrets and forbidden passion. But even while the sentences were being passed and the case closed, the resultant developments of crime were already underway for everyone concerned. Claire Adams was sentenced to life imprisonment and sent to a maximum security penitentiary. It is within the prison walls that she had time to reflect on her choices and how devastative they turned out to be not only on her life, but also on Evan's and everybody else around her. Claire spent the first few years in absolute emotional isolation, as fellow inmates shunned her and considered her to be a cold-blooded, calculating woman. She was allowed no escape from the reality of her crime and faced absolutely no chance of redemption. In the case of Evan Adams, He was first taken to a juvenile prison before he was shifted to an adult prison. Intensive therapy sessions were conducted to enable him to cope with the trauma and guilt while in juvenile detention. Evan had become a very shattered young man, totally perplexed about how his life had literally fallen to tatters so fast. Though young enough to have hope of getting another chance, the shadow of the crime he committed would continue haunting him throughout his life. Over the years, Evan began to rediscover himself within the prison walls. He became involved in educational programs and expressed his remorse through writing and art as much as possible in an attempt to find some piece of peace. Though the weight of it all was something that would never leave him completely. He thus carried the burden of not only having killed his father, but also of having allowed himself to be engaged with a forbidden relationship that led to destruction. For the Cleveland community, the Adams case was a story to be retold for generations. The house in which everything happened was sold and eventually razed, but the memories of the crime still remained. The family was still remembered by neighbors, the newspaper headlines still resounding in the minds of those who had lived through the scandal firsthand. For many, the Adams story served as a cautionary tale about how appearances can be so very wrong, and how families can harbor secrets that, when revealed, may be catastrophic. It further had an impact on the legal and law enforcement community in Cleveland. The investigations into John Adams' disappearance were diligently gone through, with procedures adjusted to take similar warning signs seriously in the future. Debates regarding the nature of Claire's influence on Evan were quite fervent. The case fomented debate about emotional manipulation and legal responsibility. While Claire spent the rest of her days locked behind bars, with no parole to set her free, and Evan found himself lost for meaning in all this darkness, the world outside these prisons kept moving on. But to those who did remember, the story of the Adams would never be forgotten. It served as the bitter reminder that impulsive decisions and unseen desires are capable of engaging gears in a chain of events that, once set in motion, cannot be halted, and can go on to destroy lives, leaving sharp scars on those remaining behind.